Between the autumn of 2003 and the summer of 2004, a killer moved through Seoul, and almost no one connected the deaths. For nearly a year, he murdered again and again, and the victims seemed to have nothing in common at all. First, the wealthy and the elderly, in their own quiet homes. Then, women, one after another, who simply vanished. Two victim groups that, on paper, could not be more different, and yet one hand connected them all. Untangling how that could be, and why it took so long to see, is the work of this entire story. A grandmother in a comfortable house, a young woman leaving for what she thought was work. On the surface, no connection at all. And that gap, that seeming randomness, was exactly what let him keep going. By the time he was caught, he had confessed to killing more than 20 people. 20 lives. In under a year, in a single city. That is the scale we are dealing with, and it is almost too large to feel. So we will try, instead, to hold on to the pieces of it that are human. To say 20 is to say a number, and numbers slide off the mind. So think instead of 20 dinner tables with an empty chair, 20 phones that stopped being answered. 20 families walking into a future that had a hole torn in the middle of it. That is the true weight of this case, and it does not fit into a single figure. Korea would come to know him as the Raincoat Killer, and his case would expose something almost as disturbing as the murders themselves. How easily a society can overlook the people it has already decided not to see. Because that is the thread that runs through everything you are about to hear. Not just how a man killed, but who a city noticed and who it did not. This is the story of Yoo Young-chul. Not to glorify him, but to understand how he operated, why he went unnoticed for so long, and who paid the price for that silence. There is a responsible way to tell a story like this and an irresponsible one. The irresponsible way lingers on the gore, ranks the atrocities, and turns the killer into a dark celebrity. The responsible way asks harder questions. How did the warning signs get missed? Why did some victims matter more than others? What has actually changed since? This telling chooses the second path. It will not flinch from the facts, but it will not feed the myth either. We will not linger on the worst details of what he did. This killer wanted to shock. He built part of his identity on horror. To dwell on that is to give him exactly what he was after, so the focus here stays where it belongs, on method, on failure, and on the victims. To begin, you have to picture Seoul in this period. It was a huge, modern, fast-moving city, confident, prosperous, the kind of place where people believed they were safe in their own neighborhoods. Neighbors trusted neighbors. Doors were locked at night, but out of habit, not out of terror. There was no sense that a stranger might be moving among them, studying which homes to enter and which people would not be missed. By the early 2000s, South Korea had transformed itself into a wealthy, connected, technologically advanced nation. Seoul was its beating heart. It was not a place that expected to be hunted. In a single generation, the country had gone from war and poverty to prosperity and global reach. There was a powerful national sense of progress, of having arrived. A methodical serial killer stalking the capital did not fit that story of a nation on the rise. Perhaps that is part of why the early signs were so hard to accept. And into that confidence stepped a man carrying a very deep and very specific rage. Understanding that rage is not the same as excusing it. Millions of people endure hardship, resentment, and failure without ever harming another soul. What separated him was not the presence of grievance, but the decision to answer it with murder. That decision was his, and no circumstance made it inevitable. Every serial case has a before, a version of the world just prior to the killings, when the danger already existed but no one yet knew its name. This is that quiet before, and it did not last long. Seoul in 2003 was not a city braced for a serial killer. Violent crime existed, of course, but the idea of a predator methodically hunting strangers across the capital was not something people lived in fear of. That normalcy was part of his cover. Before the killings, Yoo Young-chul was not a mystery figure who appeared from nowhere. He had a long history with the law. He had drifted through a series of crimes and prison terms over the years: theft, fraud, other offenses, A life spent mostly on the wrong side of the system. He was not a stranger to police files, but nothing in that record marked him, in advance, as a man who would become one of the country's most prolific killers. He was, on paper, a repeat petty offender, unremarkable, easy to underestimate, and that ordinariness is a recurring feature of these cases. The image of a monster is comforting, because monsters stand out. Real killers far more often blend in completely. If you passed him on the street in early 2003, you would have seen nothing. A man in his early 30s. Forgettable. That is not a failure of observation. It is the plain reality that evil rarely announces itself. We want the dangerous to be visible. We want to believe we would know one if we saw one. Cases like this are frightening, precisely because they tell us that is not true. By his own account, and by the accounts of those who studied him later, he was a man consumed by resentment. Resentment toward the wealthy, whom he blamed for his own failures. And, disturbingly, resentment toward women tied to the collapse of his personal life. He nursed a worldview in which he was the wronged party. Society had failed him. The rich had what he deserved. Women had betrayed him. In his mind, he was not a criminal but a kind of avenger, settling a score the world owed him. Psychologists call this a grievance narrative. The offender rewrites himself as the true victim, and everyone else as complicit in his suffering. Once that story hardens, almost any cruelty can be justified inside it. That distortion matters, because it shaped who he chose to kill. His victims were not random in his own twisted logic. They were symbols, standing in for the forces he believed had ruined his life. This is one of the most important things to understand about a killer of this type. To him, the individual person in front of him mattered far less than what they represented. That is what allowed him to do what he did without the hesitation most people cannot override. He was released from prison in the autumn of 2003. And within roughly 2 weeks, the killing began. There is a bleak question buried in that timeline that societies keep having to face. What is the purpose of imprisonment if a man can walk out of it exactly as dangerous as he went in, or more so? It is not a question this case answers. It is one it forces us to sit with. That timing matters. This was not a slow slide into violence. It was a man who walked out of a cell and, almost immediately, put a plan into motion. Think about what that says about him. Not a man overwhelmed by a sudden impulse, but one who had, it seems, been preparing. The rage did not build slowly on the outside. It was already there, fully formed, waiting for the door to open. There is a chilling implication in that. The system that released him had no way of seeing what was coming, because the danger lived entirely inside him. No parole board can read a mind, and a man determined to hide his intentions can walk right through every safeguard. Prison had not rehabilitated him. If anything, by the accounts that followed, it had concentrated him. He came out more certain of his grievances, not less. The first phase of his crimes targeted a very particular kind of victim, the wealthy elderly in the affluent neighborhoods of Seoul. His method was chillingly deliberate. He would gain entry to expensive homes, often in quiet upscale districts, and attack the residents inside. His very first attack, in late September 2003, was on an elderly couple in their own 2-story house in a wealthy part of the city, an older man and his wife. They had lived long lives and built a home together. In their later years, in a comfortable neighborhood, they had every reason to feel that the dangers of the world were behind them. That a stranger could turn their own home into the site of such violence is the kind of fact that unsettles a whole city, because it tells everyone that safety itself can be an illusion. It happened barely 2 weeks after his release. The speed is staggering. Whatever restraint prison had imposed evaporated almost the moment he was free. 2 weeks. Barely enough time to find a place to stay, to settle back into the outside world. And in that same window, he had already selected a target, planned an approach, and killed. It reframes his time in prison entirely. Not as a pause in his violence, but as a delay he was simply waiting out. They were people at the end of long lives, in the home they had built together, in one of the safest seeming corners of the city, and it was there that the violence began. There is something particularly disturbing about a predator who chooses the settings people trust most. We build our sense of safety out of familiar things. Our own street, our own front door, the quiet of a weekday afternoon. He understood that sense of safety, and he used it as a weapon, entering precisely the places where people had let their guard down. A locked door, a familiar street, the privacy of one's own living room. These are the things that make us feel safe. He turned each of them into the scene of an attack. Over the following weeks and months, he struck again in similar homes. Elderly residents, people who felt secure behind their own doors, killed in the one place they should have been safest. The weapon he favored was a blunt instrument, a heavy, brutal tool. This was not a subtle killer. His approach relied on force and surprise, rather than cunning at the scene. He overpowered people in their own homes quickly and violently before they could react or call for help. He often disguised his intentions to get close, presenting himself as someone with a reason to be there. By the time a victim understood the danger, it was already too late. The threshold of a front door was the last safe line, and he crossed it again and again. And he took steps to cover his tracks. He tried to destroy evidence at some scenes, even using fire to erase what he had done. This is the behavior of an organized offender. Someone thinking about the aftermath, about forensics, about not being caught. It is one of the traits that separates a planner from a person who kills in a single moment of rage. Investigators classify offenders in part by how much they plan and control. A disorganized offender leaves chaos, acts on impulse, and is often caught quickly. An organized one prepares, cleans up, and adapts. He was firmly the second kind, and that is a large part of why he was able to continue for as long as he did. To the police, these early murders were baffling, for one specific reason. There was no obvious connection between the victims and their killer, no motive that pointed anywhere, no robbery that fully explained it, no personal link. Investigators are trained to follow relationships. Who benefited? Who held a grudge? Who knew the victim? But when a killer selects strangers based on what they represent rather than who they are, every one of those threads leads nowhere. It is one of the reasons serial predators who target strangers are so dangerous. They break the basic logic that most investigations depend on. Most murders are solved because most murders make sense. There is a relationship, a motive, a story that connects killer and victim. Detectives follow that story backward to the door of the guilty. A stranger killer erases the story before it can be followed. And when the victims themselves are people, the system is slow to prioritize. That difficulty is multiplied. The absence of a motive meets the absence of urgency, and a killer thrives in the space between. To catch such a killer, investigators often have to wait for the one thing the killer cannot fully control. A pattern, a repeated behavior, a signature that links scene to scene. Until that emerges, they are almost working blind. These were not crimes of passion or greed in any simple sense. They were, in a way, attacks on the category of person, on wealth itself as you saw it. When violence is aimed at what people represent rather than who they are, anyone who fits the category becomes a potential target. That is what makes ideological or grievance-driven killing so frightening. The victim does not need to have done anything at all. Existing as a symbol is enough, and that made them incredibly difficult to solve. When a killer has no relationship to the victim, the usual threads an investigation pulls on simply are not there. For a while, the murders of the wealthy created fear in those neighborhoods. But then, Yoo Young-chul changed his pattern entirely. For investigators, the change was disorienting. The profile of the victims flipped completely. To an outside eye, it could look like two different killers entirely. That confusion bought him time. And this is where the case turns, and where its darkest social lesson begins. He shifted his focus from the wealthy to a completely different group. Women. And specifically, women who were among the most vulnerable and least protected in society. This shift is one of the most studied aspects of the case. A killer changing victim type so completely is unusual, and it revealed how much his crimes were driven by his internal hatreds rather than any single practical goal. Both groups, in his mind, represented something he despised. The wealthy for what they had. The women for what he blamed them for. His victim selection was not really about them at all. It was about the war he was fighting inside his own head. This is why trying to find a rational, external motive for such crimes so often fails. The logic was internal and self-referential. The victims were props in a private drama of grievance and revenge that only made sense inside his own distorted mind. Many of them were women who worked at massage parlors, women involved in sex work, women on the margins. It is worth being clear and humane about who these women were. They were people trying to survive, often under difficult circumstances, doing work that society stigmatizes, even as it quietly tolerates it. That stigma did not just shame them in life. It endangered them in the most literal way by making their disappearances easier to ignore. He would contact these establishments, request that a woman be sent to a location, and lure his victims to him that way. Understand what made this so effective and so horrifying. These were women whose movements were not closely tracked, whose absences might not be reported quickly, if at all. When a woman in this situation disappeared, there was often no immediate alarm. Sometimes it was assumed she had simply left, moved on, walked away from the work. Society had, in a sense, pre-written an explanation for their absence. A woman in that life leaving without a word was treated as ordinary, even expected. That assumption became the perfect cover for murder, and Yoo Young-chul understood that. He chose victims precisely because he believed their disappearances would not be taken seriously. Sit with how calculated that is. He was not only choosing who to kill, he was exploiting a prediction about how the rest of society would respond, or fail to respond. He weaponized indifference itself. And for a long and terrible stretch, his prediction held. Read that again slowly. He did not merely find vulnerable victims. He engineered his entire method around society's indifference to them. Their marginalization was, to him, a tool. This is the coldest calculation in the entire case. He did not just hunt the vulnerable. He hunted the overlooked, because being overlooked was itself their protection stripped away. Over a period of months, woman after woman vanished after being sent to meet a client. And for too long, the pattern was not recognized for what it was. Each disappearance, taken alone, could be explained away. It was only together, seen as a series, that they screamed the truth. And the people positioned to see them together were not, at first, the police. This is the recurring tragedy of serial cases. The pattern is invisible from inside any single incident. It only appears when someone steps back far enough to see the whole. And the people with that vantage point were, in this case, the frightened workers of an industry the authorities were not watching closely. The victims in this phase were disposed of in ways meant to prevent discovery and identification. You went to great lengths to make sure these women could not be traced back to him, or even named. Think about the compounded cruelty of that. First their lives were taken, then their very identities were attacked, so that even in death they might disappear into anonymity. For the families who did report these women missing, this created an agonizing limbo. Loved ones simply gone, with no answers, no closure, and in some cases, for a time, no one in authority treating it as urgent. Ambiguous loss, some psychologists call it, the particular torment of not knowing. Grief cannot complete itself when there is no confirmation, no body, no answer. Families were suspended in that state, and the delay in taking the cases seriously extended their suffering. Imagine reporting a sister missing and sensing that, because of how she made her living, her case was not a priority. That is a second injury laid on top of the first, and many families of these victims lived it. For months, then, two things were happening at once. Women were dying, and the system was slow to notice, because of who those women were. If these had been victims from powerful families, the response would almost certainly have been faster. That uncomfortable truth sits at the heart of this case. This is not hindsight moralizing. It is the central, documented lesson that Korean society itself took from the case. The speed of a response too often depended on the status of the victim, and a killer had learned to hide inside that gap. So how was he finally caught? Not, at first, through the machinery of a great investigation, but through the very community he was preying on. The people who ran and worked in these establishments began to notice something terrible. Their coworkers, their employees, were going out on calls and never coming back. 1, vanishing might be dismissed. 2, unsettling. But several, in a short span, from the same kind of call, formed a shape too clear to ignore. The people living inside that fear could no longer pretend it was coincidence. They lived with the fear directly. Every call could be the killer. Every friend who left for a job might not return. That is the atmosphere in which they decided they could not simply wait. Within that world, word spread. Women were vanishing after being sent to a particular kind of client. A pattern was forming in the minds of the people closest to the danger. It is worth pausing on this. The first people to truly connect the dots were not detectives with case boards. They were ordinary workers in a stigmatized industry, piecing together a horror from the empty chairs of friends who never returned. And so they did something extraordinary. They set out to catch him themselves. A plan was put in place to identify the man behind the calls. When Yoo made contact again, arrangements were made not to deliver another victim, but to trap him. There was enormous risk in this. These were not trained officers. They were potential victims themselves, deciding to lure a killer toward them because waiting for the system to act had cost too many lives already. In July 2004, that trap closed. Yoo Young-chul was seized by people connected to the very community he had been destroying and handed toward the police. After months in which the machinery of the state had not stopped him, it was this, a trap set by the hunted, that finally ended the killing. There is no comfortable way to hold that fact. The formal apparatus of law and order, with all its resources, was outpaced by a group of ordinary, frightened people who simply refused to keep losing their friends. Their courage is the one bright thread in an otherwise unbearably dark story. There was even a moment where the situation nearly slipped. In the chaos around his capture and early custody, there was a point where he briefly got away before being secured again. It is a detail that could have turned catastrophe into an even greater one. For a short, tense window, the most wanted man in the country was loose again after finally being caught. That he was recaptured spared Seoul a nightmare, but it is a reminder of how fragile even a success can be. But in the end, he was in custody. The Raincoat Killer, as he would come to be called, was finally caught. And then he began to talk. The nickname came from the way he was described and depicted around the time of his capture and trial, an image that stuck in the public imagination. But a nickname can also do something unhelpful. It turns a man into a legend. And a legend is exactly what he wanted to become. Media coverage of extreme killers always walks this line. Tell the story, because it matters and because the victims deserve to be remembered, but refuse to build the monument to infamy that the killer craves. This retelling tries to stay on the right side of that line. In the years since, this case has been revisited in documentaries and retrospectives, part of a global wave of true crime interest. That attention can honor victims, or it can feed a killer's legend. The difference lies entirely in where the camera chooses to look. What Yoo Young-chul confessed to was staggering. He admitted to a long series of killings, revising the number upward as he spoke. Confessions from offenders like this are their own minefield. Some details are true, some are inflated for effect. Investigators had to carefully separate verifiable fact from performance, matching what he said against evidence rather than taking his word as gospel. Even in confession, a man like this is managing his own image. In the end, he was convicted of 20 murders. One case initially attributed to him was later found to be the work of a different killer, which tells you something about how many predators can move through a single city unseen. And as he confessed, investigators and profilers came face to face with the mind behind the crimes. This is where the case became a landmark in Korean criminal psychology. Yoo was studied closely by criminal profilers, including some of the first prominent figures in that emerging field in Korea. His case helped shape how the country understood serial murder. At the time, criminal profiling in Korea was young. Cases like this one were where the discipline was tested and built. Investigators sat across from him and tried to map the architecture of a mind that could do what he had done. The profilers who worked cases in this era were, in effect, pioneers. They were building a science of the criminal mind in real time, learning from the worst offenders the country had produced. What they learned from cases like this shaped how Korean police would approach serial and stranger crimes for years afterward. Sitting across a table from a man who had killed on this scale is not like anything in ordinary policing. The goal is not just a confession, it is understanding, because understanding is how the next one gets caught faster. What emerged was a portrait of a particular kind of offender, not raving, not obviously insane, but cold, self-justifying, and acutely aware of how the world worked and how to exploit it. He knew which neighborhoods signaled wealth. He knew which victims would trigger an urgent response and which would not. He knew how to talk his way to a doorstep. This was applied knowledge used for slaughter. He could explain himself in calm, ordinary language. He could hold a conversation. He could pass in daily life as unremarkable. And that, the profilers understood, was part of what had made him so effective. What they found was not a monster who was out of control. It was something colder, a man who was organized, deliberate, and articulate about his own hatred. He spoke of his contempt for the wealthy. He spoke of his hatred of women. He framed his crimes, in part, as a kind of revenge against a society he felt had wronged him. This is a common and dangerous self-narrative among such killers. They cast themselves as victims first, and their crimes as a form of justice. It lets them commit atrocities while feeling righteous. It is a lie, but it is a lie they tell with total conviction. And it is seductive, even to observers, if you are not careful. A killer who speaks in the language of grievance can sound almost coherent, almost sympathetic, if you forget for a moment the trail of bodies behind the words. That is exactly why his framing has to be named for what it is, a justification for murder, and nothing more. He made grotesque claims about the extent of what he had done, some of which were meant, many believed, to shock and to build his own dark legend. And that is a crucial point. Part of what a killer like this wants is exactly the horror and attention that retelling his claims provides, which is why the focus belongs not on his boasts, but on his victims, and on how he was allowed to continue for so long. Every time his most lurid claims are repeated, he wins a little. So we set them aside. What he wanted was infamy. What he deserves is to be understood as a failure of a man who preyed on the weak, and nothing more. Because that is the real lesson of the Yoo Young-chul case. It was not a story of a criminal mastermind who could not be caught. It was a story of a man who exploited the gaps in how a society watches over its people. He understood that some victims would be missed immediately, and others would barely be missed at all, and he built his crimes around that difference. That single insight is what makes this case matter beyond its body count. It is a mirror held up to a society, showing whose safety was truly guarded and whose was quietly treated as expendable. The wealthy elderly he killed made headlines. The marginalized women he killed, for a long and terrible stretch, did not command the same urgency. In the end, it was not the state that first closed the net. It was the targeted community itself, forced to protect its own because no one else did in time. There is a grim heroism in that, and also an indictment. People with little power and little protection did what the powerful and protected apparatus of the state had not yet managed to do. In December 2004, Yoo Young-chul was convicted of 20 murders and sentenced to death. The trial confirmed the scale of what he had done and delivered the harshest sentence Korean law allows. For a moment, it looked like a clean ending. But sentences and their execution are two different things. In the courtroom, the full accounting was laid out, charge after charge, victim after victim. For the families present, it was both a validation and a reopening of every wound. The law had named what happened. But naming is not the same as healing, and a verdict is not the same as peace. But here the story takes one more particularly Korean turn. South Korea retains the death penalty in law, but it has not carried out an execution in many years. The country has effectively maintained a moratorium. South Korea has not executed anyone in decades, keeping capital punishment on the books while declining to use it. The result is a kind of legal limbo for those on death row, which means that Yoo Young-chul, sentenced to die, remains alive, held in detention. His sentence exists on paper more than in practice. So the man who terrorized a city sits, year after year, in a cell, alive, aging. His victims did not get that. And their families carry the strange, heavy knowledge that the ultimate sentence handed down will most likely never actually arrive. South Korea's position on the death penalty is its own long debate. The country keeps it in law, perhaps as a statement of ultimate condemnation, while declining in practice to take a life even in cases as extreme as this. Whatever your view of that policy, its effect here is concrete. A death sentence that functions as a life sentence, and a set of families left in a permanent, unsatisfying limbo. For the families of his victims, that is its own kind of unresolved wound. A death sentence that will, in all likelihood, never be carried out. Whatever one believes about capital punishment, the families were promised, in effect, an ending that the system has quietly declined to deliver. He remains alive, years on, while their loved ones do not. The case left a lasting mark on Korea. It became a defining example of serial murder in the country, later revisited in documentaries and studied for what it revealed. For students of criminology, for police, and for the public, the case became a reference point. When Koreans discuss the worst crimes of their modern era, this one is near the top of the list. Not only for its brutality, but for what it laid bare about the country's blind spots. It pushed forward the field of criminal profiling. It forced hard questions about how quickly police respond when the missing are poor, or marginalized, or working in the shadows of society. Those questions did not stay abstract. They fed into real debates about how missing persons cases are handled, about how sex workers and other stigmatized groups are treated by police, and about the blind spots that a clever predator can hide inside. If the case has any redeeming legacy, it is in those reforms and reckonings, bought, as always, at an unbearable price. No reform brings back a single victim. But if the deaths force a society to look harder at whom it protects and whom it neglects, then at least those lessons were not entirely lost. That is the thin, cold comfort these cases sometimes leave behind. And it left behind a roster of victims whose names deserve to outlast the killers. That is the quiet injustice of true crime. The perpetrator's name is repeated endlessly, while the victims fade into a collective total. Reversing that, even slightly, is a small act of respect that costs the storyteller nothing and gives the dead back a sliver of their dignity. The elderly people, murdered in the supposed safety of their own homes. And the women, so many women, who were targeted precisely because the world had already looked away from them. 20 confirmed victims. 20 lives with histories and futures, reduced in most retellings to a number attached to his name. Reversing that even a little is part of why this story is worth telling carefully. There were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. Their work did not make them less human, and it did not make their deaths less of a tragedy. If anything, this case is a reminder that the measure of a society is how it protects those it is most tempted to ignore. Step back and see the shape of it. A man walks out of prison carrying a lifetime of resentment. Within weeks, he begins to kill. He murders the wealthy in their homes, then turns to the vulnerable in the shadows, choosing victims he believes no one will come looking for. For nearly a year he is right, until the very people he preys upon rise up and stop him where the system was too slow to. Some killers are caught by brilliant detective work. This one was stopped, in the end, by the courage of the overlooked. That reversal is the heart of the whole story. The people society watched least closely were the ones who finally saw clearly and acted. If there is a single image to carry out of this case, let it be that one. Not the killer, not his crimes, but the ones the world had written off, standing up, seeing the truth first, and stopping the man that everyone with more power had failed to stop in time. Yoo Young-chul is remembered as one of the most brutal murderers in Korean history. But the deeper story is about everyone the country almost failed to protect, and the ones it did. Remember the killer's name if you must, but remember the shape of the failure more. A predator found the seams in a society's attention and lived inside them for nearly a year. Those seams still exist, in every country, in some form. There are always people the system watches less closely. There is always a margin where a determined predator can hide. The only real defense is to keep narrowing that margin. To insist that every disappearance is treated as if it mattered, because every one of them does. The lasting question this case leaves is not about him. It is about us, and about which disappearances we treat as emergencies, and which we quietly allow to wait. Every society draws that line somewhere. Whose vanishing triggers alarm, and whose is met with a shrug. A predator like this does not create that line. He simply finds it, and moves into the shadow it casts. The uncomfortable truth is that the line was already there before he arrived, and the real work is making sure it is not there for the next one. I'm telling the stories the rest of the world never heard. If you want the next file, subscribe. It's already open.